welcome back to Sculpting Joe Rogan. One of the problems I'm having is that it doesn't really look very much like Joe Rogan. And sorry that I'm all kind of sweaty, I just came back from a run. But I'm struggling trying to get his likeness, especially his like eyebrows and all the lines that he has in his forehead. But as I'm looking at it, his head needs to be rounder and a little bit higher on the top. When you compare the size of my head, for example, so when you're taking measurements of sculptures, the one thing I try to tell people to do, you should use the reference of the notch of your ear and take measurements from that. So there's a book that I really like, it's Lenteri Sculpting the Figure. You take one of these calipers and you can measure, for example, your head from like the chin to the highest point of the skull, and then you can come over here and you can put it on. You can see this one's getting a little bit too big because, you know, he's got a bigger head than me, and it looks a little bit nicer to have just a little bit more padding. But the way you should measure to make it life size is to use one of these calipers. You use your ear hole, or like the notch of your ear, and take measurements from, for example, to the tip of your nose, and then come over here, make the mark. Take another from the ear to the forehead, one to the chin, one to the back of the head. So that's a really good reference to take measurements. But oftentimes, like if you use one of these calipers, it really helps you in the long run because then you'll be a little bit more accurate. This is kind of like what artists would do when you're drawing a figure and you're using a pencil, except in a sculptor you use one of these. That all they like doing is to not measure at all. I prefer to measure because I'm really not that good. So for me, it really helps to have some sort of way of like measuring. And there are other calipers that you can make proportional reductions, and that's a good way too. I don't really use those because I do mostly like life size, and that gives it a little bit more dimension to the sculpture. As you can see, I have the light coming from here down, and this way you can almost like color the sculpture because you want to be able to see where the shadows are of the face. So when you're looking at, for example, my face, it's a little bit bonier than his. His is a little bit like fuller. One of the problems that I have is that I tend to make people look a little bit like me, and that's kind of a problem that I struggle with. One of the things that I notice about Joe's head, or his nose anyway, is that depending on which photo you look, his nose looks different because he was in fights, I guess, and you can tell that his nose was broken at a certain point. And usually on the nose you have the nasal bone that comes down to here, and the rest is cartilage. So sometimes when you punch somebody in the nose, you could break it, and then they have to reset the nose, and that's kind of like what happens to it. One of the things that's interesting about Joe Rogan's head is that he has quite a prominent bag under his eye, and that's usually like a fatty tissue that builds up as you get older. Especially you get bags under your eye, but his is very, very prominent. Nothing really wrong with it, he built a little bit of padding here. Also keep in mind when you're doing the sculpture that you don't want to lose sight of the skull. So it's actually a little bit more important to understand the osteology of the head rather than the myology. I think that's the terms. The osteology is basically the bones underneath the skull. You want to make sure that you can tell where the sockets are, where the zygomatic bone is peeking out. And generally, even if you don't know a lot about anatomy, you can look at the skull and see where the bones are coming to the surface. So it's very important to keep that in mind. So when you look at my face, and I'll take my glasses off, you should be able to see a highlight where my bones are coming out. Of course, it's a little bit padded with fat and skin, but you should be able to tell where the bones are coming out. As you can see, it's not exactly him. I did measure quite a bit, but I am struggling with it. I'm going to keep working on it, see if I can pull it together. And I have run out of clay, but this clay here is what I got from inside Joe's head. It's not great clay for doing another sculpture because it tends to be a little bit hard and you have to wet it quite a bit. So what I usually do with this waste clay, I try to do like little sculptures, like hand sculptures, and I'll show you probably in another video what I do with it. I'll probably do a hand sculpture. I haven't done one in a while. The things I'm finding with sculpture is that, and working from photographs, like even though Joe Rogan's super famous, there's very limited amount of really great photos that show his head in 3D. Half the time it's like studio light that it just floods his face full of light and doesn't really show the underlying structure. But I do know a little bit of anatomy, so I've been like paying attention to anatomy books and like the skull. When you look at my sculpture, as most people already know, there are thirds into the face. Generally, you take a measurement from the hairline to the superciliary arch, which is the eyebrow ridge, and then to the bottom of the nose, and then the next is the bottom of the chin. So I found that Joe Rogan's, from the superciliary arch to the bottom of the nose, it's a little bit longer than most people. Also, his head is very massive. When you work out, you know, not only just work the muscles like your biceps, your pectoralis, and all the muscles around like trapezius and stuff, but your head muscles actually get bigger. And yes, we do have muscles in the face and the skull. We have like the temporal muscles. We have muscles on the side. So these things do add to the mass of his head. I did want to give it a little bit of an expression. Like if you watch the video in the beginning, you'll notice that I do the sculptures mostly like head on, and then I modify it later on. One of my favorite tools recently is this tool, mainly because of this side. I can do moves like this. Just use it and push it and model the nose. I'm using this reference photo as my guide. It's a little blurry. And I'm just going to take a little bit of clay from here and put it on the side. He's got a little bit more right here. So what I do is I add it and then I use my tool to just kind of push it around. For example, if I have a lot of imperfections in the nose, I can use it to rake the clay like this. And even though it looks like I'm removing the geometry, which is not the intention, it's letting me make it a little bit more seamless by pushing things the way they should be. And you can use the back side of the tool to kind of... Like at this point in the sculpture, it's about making little moves. It's not about making very large cosmetic changes here. If you were to look at the nose, there's a lot of things that are happening. You actually want to make it simple, like remove a lot of the small tiny bumps that don't mean anything. But the idea is that you have the bridge of the nose here, and somehow like he got punched like that and his nose went off to the side. But the nostril doesn't attach like to the skin as much as people think. There is a break in the back of the nostril that does not connect to the cheek. So a lot of people that I've seen, they connect the nose, the nostril to the cheek. We also want to sculpt the area surrounding the nose. At this point, I really want to just add a little bit of clay, and when I add clay like this, I add it and I just use my finger to kind of roll it. It definitely helps to have points of view of his face from side and the front, and like a 3/4 profile. And there is a lot of photos from Joe Rogan, just not the ones I really am looking for. It's always much better to do sculptures from life instead of photos. And generally, like doing celebrity stuff, it's kind of tacky, and I do realize that. But since I don't have access to models, celebrities are pretty good to do because there's a lot of footage of them. I'm looking at a profile now of Joe Rogan, and I can see he's got a little bit more padding to here, and he's looking down on my sculpture, but on this photo he's looking up. So there's quite a few divisions to the nose as well. When you look at the nose, oftentimes it's divided right down the middle like that, and you can probably even feel it on your nose. But some people are less obvious than others, but they're all divided a little bit more padding on each side. When people get plastic surgery, then nobody really knows. So it's kind of important when you do celebrities that you realize that they might have gotten the plastic surgery on their nose. This bit here is the lower cartilage, I guess you can say, that kind of pulls that area out. Then you have the same here, and on his it's asymmetrical. Generally, you have at the highest point here, that's where the cartilage meets the bone. And if you look at it from the side, you should be able to tell it. You can probably even feel it on your own nose. This section right here is the lateral cartilage, and it's a little triangle like this. So this is the lateral cartilage. The nostril is known as the alar fat pad, and it's very distinctive from person to person. So keep in mind that this part, this little separation here, is the septum. Also very important to note that some people have this division a little bit more obvious, which is the greater alar cartilage. The line goes all the way back into the nose. When you look at the very bottom, it actually separates. So there's like usually a little bit that goes off to the side, like this, on both sections. So kind of important to add that. This wraps around the cylinder of the mouth. When you look at the mouth, it is very much like the shape of a Coke can, not flat. A lot of people make it flat. When you look at this surface of the bridge of the nose here, the nostril actually sits further back than that. So when you look at it from the top, this part where my tool is at is actually further to you than this. So keep that in mind and don't make the nostril in the same line, because in the shape of the mouth is very cylindrical, almost like a Coke can, making this a little bit more obvious than it has to be. You can take the tool and just kind of push it this way, and this is all just for effect. But even if you have this underlying like structure, it's not going to hurt you. And even from underneath, just kind of look up. So I'm creating these divisions, even though on Joe Rogan, this is not as obvious, the nose together. You don't want to spend too much time on the nose, do you? And I like this raking tool because it just kind of removes a lot of the surface really fast. Yeah, it's very important to kind of do a little bit of anatomy studies before you start doing sculpture. In drawing, you can kind of get away from doing any anatomy and even painting, but understanding the underneath, the structure is very important for sculpture. So even though I have the surface down, just by lightly tapping it with this cloth, really gets rid of the geometry, but the geometry is still there. You just use this to make it a little bit more of a finish. Well guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.